Hey everybody, my name is Mitchell Pearson here at Pragmatic Works, and in this video, we're going to be just going over some of the commonly asked questions that we recently received in our Azure workshop that we did. If you missed that workshop, we dove into the world of Azure Data Services for 3 hours, and we looked at a lot of really cool things in there, like Azure Storage, SQL Server, Azure Data Factory, and even Azure Synapse. So if you missed it, go back and take a look at it and then come back and take a look at this quick Q&A that we're going to be covering here in this video. All right, so without further ado, the first thing we want to do is kind of look at some of those questions. So what was the first question that we got here? And it was really around general purpose or Azure Data Lake. So when I'm building an Azure storage account, should I go with general purpose or should I go with an Azure Data Lake account? One of the things that we recommend around this is you probably should start off with an Azure Data Lake unless you need some of those feature functionalities that exist in general purpose, but not in Azure Data Lake. And what are those? Well, general purpose account gives you things like worm storage. Worm storage is where you can write the data one time, but you can read the data many times. And that's a pretty cool piece of functionality that you get that you don't get with Azure Data Lake. And that helps out with some of those kind of governmental requirements a lot of times that financial institutions have. You also get the capability of doing things like soft delete. So if a file gets deleted, maybe accidentally, unintentionally, or maybe maliciously, you can recover that if you have soft delete turned on. Azure Data Lake Store Gen 2 currently today does not support that. And then of course we get Blob versioning as well with the general purpose account, but Azure Data Lake doesn't have that. Now, a minute ago I said, hey, we recommend you start with an Azure Data Lake. And then I give you a list of all the things that Azure Data Lake doesn't support. Well, the reason we recommend Azure Data Lake is because you get that price similarity, you get the different storage tiers, but you also get Azure Active Directory integration. You get that POSIX compliance. You get the security that you can apply on the file structure. You get that true file structure, unlike a general purpose account. And so from a security perspective, from a normalcy perspective, what you're kind of used to with on-prem file systems, you get that with Azure Data Lake, whereas you don't with general purpose. So if you need those other features, you need worm storage, you need soft delete, then maybe for that data source specifically, you have a general purpose account. But in general, we recommend Azure Data Lake because of the similarity that you now get with version 2 of those storage accounts. Another question we got, this is a quick one. Can you switch between a general purpose account and a Data Lake Gen 2? So I'm creating my account today. I'm not sure if I want a general purpose account or a Data Lake. I'm not quite sure. Can I just create one and then switch to the other? I mean, you create both of them with the same resource in Azure. You just go to the storage account. And the answer is no, you can't do that. You need to know up front what you're going to do. And so if you create it as an Azure Data Lake store, it's going to remain an Azure Data Lake store. If you create it as a general purpose account, it's going to be a general purpose account. And so the answer to that question is no, you cannot, but you can have multiple storage accounts. So you can have some storage accounts that are Azure Data Lake Store, and they are for specific data sources coming from specific vendors or customers or web applications. And then you can have general purpose accounts that you need soft delete, you need worm storage for that financial aspect of your industry or of your organization. So you can have multiple variations of this to solve your need. You're not limited to one storage account and it has to be a certain thing. So keep that in mind as you are kind of scoping out your engagement. And this was another interesting one here. This was, how do you move Azure Resources? Can you move Azure Resources? We had quite a bit of conversation about putting your Azure Resources in a specific location so that you could save on cost and so that you could remove latency, so you could improve performance. And then that, of course, led to other questions like, well, what if I put them in the wrong resource location? Can I move them? Can I move them from one resource group to another? And so the answer to that question is yes, you can. You can absolutely move it from one resource group to another. And you can also move it from one region in Azure to another. And you do that by leveraging Azure Resource Mover. However, there is a caveat to this that's worth discussing and worth mentioning, which is if you move it from one resource group to another, that's going to change the IDs and it's going to do some stuff in there. And if you move it from one region to another, optionally, it could do that as well. Now, Azure Resource Mover is not a tool that I have worked with, but we can go and quickly take a look at that here in Azure. And if I go over here, you'll notice that there is a resource group. There was a blog written about this just a couple of months ago in September And it talks about what is Azure Resource Mover. And you see that it's a service. It's a service that allows you to move your resources between different Azure regions. And I assume just from reading through this that it helps out with some of those problems that you would normally go through when you move your resources to different resource groups, to different regions, so on and so forth. And so read through this article, take a closer look at that. But I'm going to show you real quick, just a very quick example here of how you can move a resource if you wanted to move one within your subscription remaining in the same Azure region. You just created it in the wrong resource group. Well, what I can do is I can come over here to just a regular resource group, right? Any resource group really. And then in this resource group, what I can do is grab a resource like my Azure Storage MGP account. And I can click on that. And this is one I've already moved. So let's go back. That was a bad example. We'll grab this guy right here. And so that other one doesn't exist. Moved it, got rid of it, something happened. I just haven't refreshed it on this other computer. But when I come into this storage account right here and I open up the storage account, you'll notice across the top, one of the options that's available is the ability to move this resource. And so if I click on that, it will actually ask me if I want to move it to another resource group or if I want to move it to another subscription altogether. And so you can do this. You can easily do this through the UI. You can move resources. And if I choose to move this to another subscription or to another resource group, you'll notice what happens is down here across the bottom, we are going to get a very, very important message. In fact, let me go ahead and take myself off the screen so we can see that in full view. That simply says that I understand that tools and scripts associated with moved resources will not work until I update them to use new resource IDs. So what does this mean? What this means is that if you move a resource, you are effectively changing the resource ID in the background, and that could cause a lot of things to break downstream. I've seen this happen, right? I work at a consulting company. We jumped into Azure head first, and we took on a lot of engagements, and we had some of those growing pains, things we didn't know. Or the client wanted to put it here, and we went in and we said, okay, well, we'll move it. And these things happened where everything broke, and there were some late nights, and we had to fix those things. So be wise and learn from our mistakes. Make sure that you plan that out in advance and you build those resource groups the way that you want them. You put those resources in the subscription where you want them, because when you move them, there are some changes that are going to take place with that, and it can affect your resource IDs, and that can be problematic, obviously, as you can expect. So that was question number 3. Question number 4 was around Azure SQL database provisioning. So when we provisioned Azure SQL database, we used the DTU model. And I talked a lot about how the DTU model allowed you to have really a cheap entry point into experiencing Azure and Azure SQL databases. And so you could build a DTU model for as little as $5. The VCORE model has a lot of benefits over the DTU model. For example, it's easier to size and provision, similar to an on-prem environment. It also has higher top-end capabilities than the DTU model. It's the newer version of it. However, one of the downsides of the VCORE model is that it's a higher point of entry. If you just want to start off with the VCORE model, I think it's a few $100 per month to build out like a proof of concept, whereas with the DTU model, for $5 or $10, $15 a month, and that's it, you can build a database and you can get with it. And so then, because I kept talking about how DTU model can be used as a proof of concept and it's an easy entry point, there was some confusion around, well, can the DTU model be used for production? And the answer is yes, it can. In fact, all of our databases, if I remember correctly, here at Pragmatic Works are all DTU model. We're using it for all of them. They're not high production web applications that need to handle huge loads per se, right? So all of ours are the DTU model, and we're saving a significant amount of money because of that. So that's just something to keep in mind. But the DTU and the VCORE model, just different ways of sizing it. One other thing to keep in mind is as you're scaling your database up and scaling it down, changing the size of that, you can always switch between service tiers. So if you have a DTU model today and you want to switch that entire database over to the VCORE model, you can do that. And then when you scale it back, you can scale it back to the DTU model. So that is absolutely something that you can do. Another question we get all the time, not just in our 3-hour Azure workshop, was, can you back up your data in Azure SQL database? Well, you can to a degree, but we would caution you against that. One of the incredible benefits of Azure is that they do a lot of the work for you. That's why we go to Azure, right? And that's why we do something like platform as a service, like Azure SQL Database, because they take backups for you on a constant basis, point in time. So there's really no need for you to take a backup of the data. But if you wanted to, you could do what's called a backpack file. And you can export a backpack file. However, when you export the backpack file, the data is no longer encrypted. So your backups in Azure SQL Database, Microsoft manages them, they're encrypted. All of your data in Azure SQL Database, it's encrypted. Even when it's at rest, it's protected with transparent data encryption. That means if somebody breaks in and gets a hold of your backup file or gets a hold of your data at a Microsoft data center, even with that, they won't be able to read your data. But if you create backpack files and you export that and somebody gets a hold of the actual backpack file, it's not encrypted. So that's one thing. Plus, backpack files are not meant for backup and recovery. So can you back up your data? Kind of, sort of, you can, but it's not recommended and I wouldn't do it. Let Microsoft do what Microsoft is good at. That's why we're using Microsoft Azure. And so that was a good question. What are the best practices for choosing an Azure region? I kind of mentioned this earlier with the whole moving resources. Well, the number one thing we want to look at is where are our offices located at? Where is our business located at? Where are we going to be accessing that data from the most? And what is that proximity, right? So if our entire operation is within the East US of the United States, we should probably be choosing to put our resources in the East US of the United States. And that's going to help us out with the latency, so we get better performance when we're accessing that data, when we're writing that data, when we're reading to that data. So that's obviously going to be the number one thing. Also, we want to put our resources that we create in the same region as other resources that we have created. So if I've created a couple of Azure Data Lakes and a couple of Azure General Purpose accounts, storage accounts, and I put them in the East US, and I build an Azure SQL database, I don't want to put the Azure SQL database over in the West US or Central US, because there's a couple of things. One, there's a latency there, moving between regions. Two, there's a cost associated with that, actually called an egress charge from moving data from one data center to another. So if you do that, it can cost you, and you will actually see that line item on your Azure bill. Now, another consideration here is if you're working with some kind of disaster recovery situation and you want to store your data in a region, like a secondary region, well, in that case, now you're trying to get a little bit further away. Proximity does matter, and you want it to be further away. I don't want to put it in the same data center. I don't even maybe want to put it in the same zone. So there is zone redundant storage where you can keep it kind of in the same zone. I want to put it in a different region entirely, so that if somehow the East region goes down for whatever reason, hopefully this other region isn't also down. There's a very, very low chance that both regions, with all the redundancy, all the kind of fail safes that are in place, that two regions could go down at the same time. So you put it in a different location. So those are some of the considerations when we're kind of choosing the Azure region. Is it a primary or secondary? If it's a secondary for failover, you put it somewhere else. If it's the primary, you want to group all those together, keep that proximity, save that money. So that's another of those great questions. And here's a tough one. Is there auto-scaling in Azure? So what is auto-scaling? Auto-scaling is the ability of your resources and your services to determine the amount of resources that need to be allocated to a job or to a task that you're trying to perform. And so some resources in Azure have auto-scaling, some of them do not. For example, if you're using Azure Databricks, in Azure Databricks, you can choose your minimum number of workers, and you can choose your maximum number of workers. So you can kind of set a boundary there. And if you're not doing anything in Azure Databricks, you're not running any jobs, any notebooks, then it's always going to be idling kind of at 2 workers, and you're only going to be getting charged for 2 workers. But if you run a big job, you have a notebook that runs on a schedule and it consumes a lot of resources, it has the ability to scale automatically up to 8 workers. So not everything in Azure gives you this, but some resources do. And it's something worth taking a look at. Now, I thought, and maybe I'm just not remembering this correctly, I thought that Azure Synapse SQL Pools, formerly known as SQL Data Warehouse, was going to have the capability for auto-scaling. I know they made some changes around scaling where it's now an online operation and there's a lot of big features that were added, but I thought it was going to have auto-scaling as well. But I did quick research before this and I didn't see it. So if it's there, let us know in the comments below and let us know where we can go find that. I always go to James Serra. If you haven't checked out his blogs, he works at Microsoft. They are phenomenal. I go to him a lot of times before I go to Microsoft documentation. And so I went and looked at some of his Synapse blogs, trying to go back through them to remember some of the stuff I had researched back a while back, and I didn't see it. I didn't see it there. I didn't see it on Microsoft, but it's sometimes I just didn't find it. So let me know. Let me know if that is available. Another big question we got was, what programs did we use for the live stream that we did? And so we used a program called vMix. vMix is phenomenal for streaming. It is a program you have to pay for. So it's not free like OBS or some of the other tools that streamers use, but vMix is really great for that. And then for the drawing that we did, the zooming in, the zooming out, and just the text box, stuff like this, I've always used Zoom It, and I've been using that for about 8 years. It's 100% free. So just do a quick search for Zoom It, download it, have fun. It does a lot of really cool stuff, and it's easy to use. Another question that we got was around debugging in Azure Data Factory. And so when you're in Azure Data Factory, if you make some changes to a pipeline and you want to run it real quick and test it out before maybe you save it and publish it out to production in Azure Data Factory, we can run it in Debug. And Debug always runs the most recent changes of the code that are local that you're changing, not what's been pushed out to Data Factory, right? So that's what Debug does. It lets you run your pipelines, and in a pipeline, of course, you can run your data flows that you've created. Now, there's another feature in Azure Data Factory called Data Flow Debug. And so one of the questions we got actually a couple of times there was, what's the difference between Debug and Data Flow Debug? Like, what's the difference? Because you'll notice that if you're in a data flow, you can't run it from the data flow. You can't just run a debug operation and the data flow completes. It doesn't work that way. The difference is that Data Flow Debug is actually the provisioning behind the scenes of a Databricks cluster. So you turn on Data Flow Debug, it will provision a Databricks cluster behind the scene so that as you develop your data flow and you execute it from a pipeline using the regular debug, right? So I use the regular debug in a pipeline to call a data flow. When you do that, you don't have to wait 4, 5, 6, 7 minutes on every single time you're testing it to wait for a Databricks cluster to spin up. So you click on the Data Flow Debug in advance when you know you're going to be doing a lot of data flow development so that it will automatically provision a lightweight, doesn't cost you a whole lot of money, Databricks cluster in the background so that you can do some development quicker, because then I can go to my pipeline, click execute, click debug. It'll run in about a minute and a half, and I don't have to wait 6 or 7 minutes. This is a huge thing, and it's very beneficial. So what's the difference between Debug and Data Flow Debug? Well, they're completely different things. So that's the difference there. And then before we end this video, the last thing I want to mention is that coming in February 2021, we're going to be doing a session on Canvas apps, building applications for your mobile devices, for your company, for your organization, for your desktop, using Power Apps. If you have not played with Power Apps, it is my favorite tool, unquestionable. There's no question about it. I love it, and I never get to use it, which makes me sad. But I am going to attend this event. I'm going to watch it, and I hope that you do too. So we will see you in February at that event. Sign up, register, make sure you don't miss it because it's super cool stuff. Thank you, and have a great holiday, and we'll see you again.